Okay, so today we're going to explore the hydraulics behind the ballast tanks of the tracker sled. In front of you here is just an abstract notion of having 5 separate tanks that comprise, say, a 250-foot tracker sled. But there's got to be something connecting these tanks, the sort of piping, hose, valves, whatever it is, to allow us to fill and empty the tank from the middle, something we already concluded would do. So what I have a little tabletop display here, and this will become apparent as we go further into this idea of this sort of flexible upturned U, if you were, or downturned U that would connect the tanks. The flexibility it affords in a situation where you're moving over rough terrain. And as you'll see, the big advantage of this is that there's 2 positions it can live in. One that allows gravity feeding to going from tank to tank, and another that will allow a siphon to go from tank to tank. So first, what we're going to do to demonstrate this is actually just lay these down flat in between each one of these. And just as we would in the field with the tracker sled, we're going to fill all these tanks. I have 4 in this demonstration instead of 5 as it would be in a tank. But we're going to fill all these tanks by just introducing, again, this sort of colored water so you can see what's going on into this middle tank. And then after it distributes, we'll be back for the next part of the demonstration. Okay, so we're going now to return our sort of inverted U loop connectors to the vertical position here. And you'll notice something that's a little counterintuitive. So if the camera can zoom in here, what you're seeing is that the liquid that we colored again that are in these inverted U's at the peak is taller, right, than the water that's in the tank. And how could that possibly be? Well, for the water to fall in this tube, it would have to leave behind a vacuum, which of course it can't do. So we have something counterintuitive here. The water actually in the loop is taller than the level water in all the tanks. So this is a phenomenon that we'll use to our advantage. If we were to introduce air here, we'd actually create an airlock between these 2 tanks, which would be good in the case that this tank develops a leak, right? It wouldn't affect these. But the other thing is to actually create a helpful siphon when we literally want to pump these tanks out. So what I'll do now is I'll show that actually this, if we start spilling water from this tank, it will actually siphon the rest of the tanks as well. So I'm just going to start spilling this now, and we will come back and look at the final condition here to see if it adequately siphons all of the other tanks. Okay, I'm just now cleaning up. The last little bit is being siphoned out, and you can see that these are still completely filled and have adequately siphoned all of the other tanks. So this is something that may well be useful for us and desirable in the field. So we're now going to go to the next level of components, and I'll show you those, the hoses and the fittings that will comprise this sort of inverted U that's flexible and able to be a siphon or an airlock. Okay, so we're here at the tracker sled prototype, and where we're actually going to make these connections is on the end of the tanks here. We've already talked about the fact that the profile of this tank needs to change so it doesn't plow into the ground when it's moving. So these connections will be above ground, perhaps just leaving a little bit of volume of ballast in each and one of these tanks for stability when we move. I also want to talk about some alternatives here. Some of you might be saying, hey, what's the big deal about controlling the flow of water from one tank to another? They make stuff for that, right? They're called valves. But the difficulty in looking at a valve like this is the rigidity that's involved and entailed in mounting this from one tank to the other. This is a true union ball valve, right, which is a great candidate for something like this. It actually has a ball on the inside that as I turn the handle, that ball closes the flow. It's very intuitive to use because when the handle's across, there's no flow possible. When that handle's parallel, flow is free again. And I can get all sorts of connections on this. This is true universal because I can actually, the union, I can actually take this valve off. So this is a good candidate, but it's the rigidity of the piping that's the concern. Much more attracted to the idea of having a flexible hose. So used in agricultural settings are these fittings called plug and socket, and they have a cam lock on them. So the idea is that the plug actually fits into here and then it's locked down with the cams so that it presses against that gasket, becoming watertight. Super fast. The company that produced these, PT, originally made these fittings for the Coast Guard. The other thing I'm going to show you here is what's called a live swivel. And you can see from I'm holding it, there's a ring here of sealed ball bearings that allow this fitting to actually twist. So the idea that we're pursuing here when we connect these tanks together is they both have flexibility this way by virtue of this flexible hose, and that this can actually spin. The live swivel again is going to help us to have this idea of having the loop either up or in a down position. So we'll go to our setup right now and look at that full scale. Okay, so what we're going to demonstrate here is how this connection from tank to tank will work. This is a little bit roomy compared to what we'll have in the field, but it'll suffice for this demonstration. First, we're going to make this loop, and you'll see why I've got these in two different pieces right now. We'll go ahead and make that connection between the plug and socket, pulling on these cams to lock it in place. Because we have a live swivels, we'll go ahead and pull this down to the fill position or the gravity position, where now water will be able to flow from gravity from one tank to the other. We'll consider this the fill tank, and we'll consider this the receiving tank. We won't make you wait. We're going to fill up this tank now and take it from there. Okay, so we filled both tanks by virtue of just using this as the fill tank. And with this loop in the down position, we were able to fill by gravity. Now what we'll explore is if I turn this up, so you can actually, if the camera can get here, you can actually see we got this clear suction tubing, so it can take negative and positive pressure, but you can see that the water's still here. This is taller, right, than the elevation of the water in the bucket, defying gravity, so to speak, right? But it can't create a vacuum in here. So what we'll do is first test this siphon. We'll spring an intentional leak in this one, and then we'll follow along. We won't make you wait for this, but we'll open this up right now and see what happens. Okay, so you can see this tank is obviously emptying. The siphon here is completely still filled with water. So water is going from a lower elevation to a taller elevation, right? So this is exactly what our tabletop showed us and told us would happen. We'll let this finish off. Okay, so what just happened there is the siphon is broken, right? The minute air is admitted into this tank, this entire siphon breaks, right? So what we'll see here is just this tank will continue emptying, but not this tank. So that's expected. So the other thing we want to explain here with this setup is the idea of also, well, what is the case where a tank springs a leak unintentionally, right? So the thought is at the peak of the loop, we need to be able to admit air and create an airlock. So the idea with this fitting, which is readily available, is all I have to do is admit air and I'm done. Water will drain out of both legs and I put it right back together again. And now I don't have a siphon, I have an airlock. Super simple, no moving parts. I think it'll be perfect for the tracker sled. I should say that the components you're seeing here are a 2-inch diameter. For the tracker sled, we'll use at least a 3-inch diameter, but these pieces and parts were readily available. So that's it, the idea of having this flexible hose, able to act as a siphon or an airlock to keep either the tanks connected or completely independent.